My name is Clara Hale, and for most of my life, I've been the family's designated sideways glance, the polite embarrassment everyone tucks behind their smiles when company comes over. My sister, Vivian Hale, was born with a tuxedo and a press release attached. Perfect grades, perfect internships, perfect husband on the corporate ladder, perfect Instagram-ready home. My parents, Richard and Evelyn Hale, polished that perfection like silver. Me? I collect odd jobs and strange passions the way other people collect stamps. Pop-up supper clubs, a tiny catering van that smelled faintly of rosemary and burnt sugar, experimental event gigs that paid in tips and brutal honesty. I wore what I liked: jeans, a blazer that had seen better rooftops, flats that could sprint, while they wore statements loud enough to echo down the country club hallways I was never supposed to cross. Calling my choices unconventional was their way of saying unacceptable. At family dinners, my life was a cautionary tale told between mouthfuls of something white and foamy. When will she get serious? Why hasn't she married a partner who will finally make sense of her? You can hear the phrase in a dozen tuts and sighs, and it always lands in the same place. Me, shrinking under the weight of other people's assumptions. I tried to be practical. There was pride in bringing home a client who raved about a menu I'd designed. But to them, my work read as temporary, quirky, not a career. Which would be fine if the judgment hurt only my ego. Instead, it chipped away at my seat at the table, the right to be introduced without an apology, the small dignity of being treated as an equal. What's at stake isn't just my pride. It's the ledger they keep of who belongs and who doesn't, a secret ledger that decides which faces get served and which get shooed away. My father sits on the board of Ashford Vale Country Club, the kind of place where napkins are a statement and names are currency. Vivian's life has been a steady climb toward membership cards and gala invites. Mine has been a series of leaky tents and last-minute miracles. If there's one thing that matters to people like my parents, it's appearances. The kind that prove their dinner party theories correct. If I'm the disappointment, then every public moment, the smile, the nod, the brunch table, is available to be weaponized. So I learned to read the room years before I learned how to book a tent that wouldn't collapse in a storm. I learned not to argue when they misnamed my work. It was easier to nod and let the tiny grinding outrage build inside me like a slow-burning fuse. I learned to keep receipts, literal and otherwise, for the nights I spent making something of myself in the margins. Because if you're going to be dismissed by the people who should know you best, the only sane response is to be methodical about how you prove them wrong. There's a Sunday coming, white tablecloths, the quiet authority of stamp of approval faces, and I keep thinking about how many of those polite judgments can be upended by a single, well-placed truth. This is where the story starts, with a woman who learned to hold her tongue until the payoff made the silence taste like victory. I walked into Ashford Vale like I owned my own feet, which, in fairness, I did. Just not the membership card everyone assumed I needed. The foyer smelled like lemon oil and small talk. Chandeliers blinked approval at polished shoes. I tugged my blazer down, felt the denim braid against my wrists, and took the seat at the long brunch table where my family had already gathered. White tablecloths, linen napkins folded like tiny, smug hats. I could see the way heads tilted, two forks stopping midair because I had the audacity to be myself in a room that demanded I be someone else. Evelyn was the first to maneuver her outrage into performance. "Clara," she said, the little rasp of disbelief sharpened to a public weapon. This is not appropriate." Vivian smiled like she was offering me a charity ribbon. "Are you serious? You're wearing jeans." It wasn't about clothing. It was about the story those jeans told. To them, my clothes were evidence of instability, of choice, of not fitting neatly into their perfect labeled world. Around us, other members tuned in. A silver-haired woman below the candelabra who pretended not to listen. A man pretending to look at his phone who clearly wasn't. The air tasted like someone had left a bruise. My father's face went a color I had studied my whole life. Half anger, half calculated offense. "This is my table," he said, as if ownership multiplied his right to shame. "You need to leave." He used the imperative like it was a family heirloom. My mother added a higher, sharper voice. "You're embarrassing us." The word embarrassing landed on me like a coin, metallic, small, and meant to be dropped in a jar and forgotten. I felt the familiar squeeze of humiliation, but it didn't take the shape it usually did. Today, it was a bright, hot thing, the kind that promised action. I didn't shout. There's a particular power in being calm when a room expects the opposite. I looked at Vivian, smug, hair immaculate, and then at the club manager who'd come over with the polite, bloated smile professionals wear when mediating family weather. I could hear my father muttering to the manager, the part I couldn't quite make out through my teeth. Then he stood, smooth as a man who'd rehearsed indignation, and walked away with that particular strut board members have. Certain that rules would bend toward him. He was going to call in favors. He was going to use his name like a key. While he was gone, the table turned colder. Voices softened into sharper things. Whispers, meant to cut without leaving a mark. "This is exactly why we keep things the way we do," one of them said, loud enough. No wonder she never. Another head turned my way, and I felt the wall of eyes corralling me. They assumed I would crumple. They assumed compliance. I had practiced my small smile so many times it had calluses. When my father reached the manager's office and began to speak, his words were precise and clipped. Board meeting. Immediate action. I could hear the manager's polite, bureaucratic voice answering. I could see from the corner of the glassed-off office the way the staff folded their hands as if waiting for instructions. Someone was about to tell me I didn't belong here, and the room was already deciding how loudly to cheer the verdict. The fuse behind my jaw burned a little brighter. I watched my father's back through the glass and let the room do what it always did, assume the ending. He was saying board and immediate action, like he owned the verbs in the English language, and the manager's polite nod was already rehearsed. Then the manager's smile faltered, a tiny thing like a blown fuse, and he turned halfway toward the door, as if he'd forgotten something important. That's when I stood up. I walked into the manager's office instead of waiting for him to come find me. The air inside smelled faintly of new leather and floor polish. Things you only notice when you're used to the smell of fryer oil and coffee grounds. I set my hands on the desk, and I didn't ask. I pulled a slim folder from my bag and laid it on the glass like an offering that doubled as a challenge. Inside was the corporate resolution, the deed, the letterhead from Hearthline Hospitality Group, and a copy of last month's regional magazine with a spread about the new Westbridge and a byline that had my name printed under it. Clara Hale, CEO, Hearthline Hospitality Group. The room went very quiet in a way that felt loud. My father turned, confusion washing his practiced indignation out of his face like someone had taken the script away. Vivian's charity smile dissolved into a fierce, instant recalibration. My mother made a sound that was half gasp, half small animal. The manager, who'd been ready to reach for a polite form, instead pushed his chair back and said, with all the professional bafflement of someone whose calendar had just been upended, "You? What?" I let the folder do the talking. The deed showed a closing date 8 months earlier. The renovation budgets showed the lines where millions had been allocated. Landscaping, the kitchen overhaul, the redesign of the dining room that, ironically, had always been their measuring stick for class. They looked at those documents like relics from a parallel universe where I was an alternate version of Clara who'd never been dismissed. "You bought this place?" my father asked, and the question came out thinner than he intended. Vivian reached for the magazine as if proximity might transfer understanding by touch. My mother's hands trembled on the linen. I could see them trying to compute 3 things at once. The money, the secrecy, the fact that for years they'd treated me like I was not only poor in bank accounts, but bankrupt in ambition. There was an almost comic pause where everyone awaited the punchline, some clever retort that would explain it all away, then realized there was no joke. I had been the quiet, inconvenient truth in their tidy family narrative. Not failed, not floundering, but unseen. That blankness had allowed them to believe whatever story suited their dignity. Now, folded and printed and stamped, the evidence collapsed their version into something smaller and more fragile. My father opened his mouth to say something about conflict of interest, about meetings and bylaws, and I let him. I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time, I watched them try to take me down with the very machinery they thought they controlled, and find, to their surprise, that the gears no longer belonged to them. They watched me as if I were a weather event, unexpected, inconvenient, and impossible to ignore. I took a breath that tasted like coffee and late nights and every small, humiliating comment they'd ever made, and I let it steady me. "You've treated me like I didn't exist," I said, quiet enough that it cut through the racket. "You've spoken about my life like it was a cautionary tale at dinner parties. You've used this club as a stage to prove whatever point you needed to make about me. That ends now." Saying it aloud made it more concrete than any document I'd slid across a desk. My father's jaw tightened in that old, familiar way. He was processing the possibility that control had slipped from his hands. "Clara," he started, the old paternal cadence trying to click back into place. Vivian's face had gone a color I'd seen on stage lights. Recalculation. My mother's fingers clutched the napkin as if it were a talisman. I didn't want a scene. I wanted accountability. So I did what owners do when something in their house is broken. I fixed it. Calmly, precisely, I told the manager that, per the club's bylaws and the powers vested in ownership, I was immediately suspending Richard Hale's board privileges pending a review. I then informed him I was suspending the membership privileges of Evelyn and Vivian Hale for 30 days. I slid a typed notice across the desk, formal, unemotional, impossible to misread. There was an audible intake of breath around the table. A woman near the window actually put down her tea. The manager, who a minute ago had been fumbling for the right phrase to tell me to leave, now became a flurry of professional procedure, noting dates, murmuring about bylaws, asking if I wanted a public statement. I nodded. Let the record show I had offered them time to reflect. Not humiliation, not revenge theater. 30 days is long enough to take inventory, but short enough to be merciful. "You can't do that," my father said finally, more panic than pride peeking through. "Board positions aren't... There's protocol." It was an argument framed as process because the human part of him knew he was losing ground. "There's protocol when people follow rules," I replied. "There are consequences when they weaponize a space I own to demean my presence. You'll have 30 days to read the renovations, to meet the staff, to understand the decisions I made that brought this place from tired to thriving. If you want to talk after that, on equal footing, then we'll talk. If not, we'll keep handling club governance the way it needs to be handled." I could see the corner of Vivian's mouth quiver. It was the first honest emotion I'd watched on her face in years. They protested. Pleas, bluffs, familial indignation dressed up as legal concern. Staff hovered like discreet witnesses. A few longtime members shifted awkwardly, some offering thin smiles of support, others averting their eyes as if not to complicate the spectacle. Security, instructed in advance by me so nothing ugly would happen, remained politely present but silent. I didn't want them to be escorted out. I wanted them to leave with the taste of consequence and the space to reckon. As they gathered their things, Vivian's clutch, my mother's fan of disbelief, my father stopped at the doorway. For a moment, I thought he would speak. He didn't apologize. He didn't storm out. He simply looked at me in a way I'd been waiting for my whole life. Measuring, trying to find the daughter he thought he knew in the woman who had made his table into her boardroom. 30 days, I said. Think, read, and then, maybe, apologize if you mean it. It was not a demand for theatrics. It was an invitation to actual work. They left under the chandeliers, heads held in varied states of defeat and dignity. The table resumed its brunch rhythm as if a small earthquake had just been politely noted on the news. When the door clicked shut behind them, the room felt different, less like a stage and more like a place where decisions lived. I sat back down, fingers still warm from the paper. For a brief second, relief washed over me, then steadied into something harder. A knowing that power without mercy becomes the thing you use to hate. I'd put time between us, and I'd given them a chance that required more than words. That night, I slept with a ledger of receipts on the nightstand and a curious, cautious sense that the family narrative had begun, for the first time, to realign. I didn't rush into anything after they left. Power feels cheap if it's only spectacle, so I phoned the lawyer I use for the business, quiet, practical Hannah Ortiz, because I wanted the fix to be clean and unambiguous. Hannah sat across from me with a pen tucked behind her ear like a bookmark and walked me through what would hold up. A written reconciliation offer, clear conditions, deadlines, and documentation of every step. "You don't need a courtroom," she said. "You need clarity." She drew up the letter. Neutral, firm, impossible to misread. It said, in plain language, what I expected. An earnest written apology to be delivered to me and the club membership, participation in a scheduled review of the club's dress code policy with staff and board, and an explicit commitment to respect my ownership and the decisions I made for the club going forward. There was also a clause that made clear the offer could be rescinded if they used the club's forums to defame or undermine staff. I sent the letter the next morning, not as a threat, but as an invitation, accountability framed like a door left open. I wanted them to understand that reconciliation required work, not theatrics. The 30-day suspension was almost up. The legal timestamp made everything feel more real. Viv and my parents called. Short, staccato conversations at first. Then my father asked to meet, privately, in the small conference room off the clubhouse office. He arrived with his tie loosened. Not a meltdown, but a weathered sort of humility I hadn't seen from him in years. We started with the apology. It wasn't a single theatrical line. It was a halting conversation that twined into each other. Small admissions, explanations that read like defenses until they softened into something quieter. "I thought success looked a certain way," he said. "I thought you'd fail in the ways I could easily explain to people. I was protecting my reputation, and in the process, I didn't see you." He didn't try to dress it up. The awkward honesty of it made the room feel less like a courtroom and more like a living room where people were finally taking turns speaking. He wrote the apology down on club letterhead and handed it to me. Formal, yes, but sincere. It read like someone who had practiced the words until they stopped sounding like armor. Part of what surprised me was that he agreed to the policy review. At first, he talked about precedent and bylaws the way it was his native tongue. But then he listened when I explained why dress codes had been a cudgel in our family room for so long. An external way to measure and dismiss anyone who looked different from his ideal. We scheduled a meeting with Hannah, the club manager, and 2 staff members who'd worked through the renovation. People who actually lived the day-to-day of the place I'd bought. The review was surprisingly productive. Numbers, photographs of the new dining spaces, testimonials from staff about how the updated policies helped diversity and hospitality. We debated language, what constituted appropriate dress and what crossed into policing identity. And I watched my father read, under the bright projector light, passages that had previously been invisible to him. Vivian participated too, although less gracefully. Her first draft of apology was stiff, then softer after the staff spoke about how exclusion shows up not only in overt insults, but in the quiet assumptions we make about someone's worth. She nodded when a server explained that hospitality runs on dignity. Yours, mine, everyone's. It landed. The more people explained the practical reasons behind decisions I'd made, staffing changes, kitchen upgrades, revenue numbers from private events, the less defensible their old assumptions looked. Money wasn't magic. It was work. The dress code conversation, oddly, became the place where our family's deeper misreadings were aired and, for the first time, corrected in public. When it was over, my father asked for a minute alone. He closed the office door and, without theatrical flourish, said, "I'm proud of what you've built. I was wrong to measure you by what I expected." He spoke like someone finally learning a new language, slow, patient, and a little shaky. He didn't beg forgiveness. He offered a change in behavior. "I'll step back from saying things at the club about your choices. I'll listen before I make judgments." That mattered more than anything I could have demanded. Actions sometimes land truer than scripted apologies. We shook hands. Not a victory grip, but an agreement to try. I accepted their written apologies, and more importantly to me, their presence in the policy review and the signed commitment to respect my ownership decisions going forward. The legal agreement Hannah drafted stayed in place as a safety net. But the real work that would change the texture of our relationship was human. Listening, showing up, and admitting error. It was less cinematic than the folder I'd once slid across a glass desk, but it felt steadier. When I left the conference room that afternoon, there wasn't a choir or a parade. There was something quieter, a ledger balanced not in numbers, but in honesty. I knew this wasn't a fairy tale fix. Old habits have long legs, but it was the start of repair on terms that asked for real labor from everyone involved. That night, I let myself feel a rare thing: cautious relief. The next Sunday, I walked into Ashford Vale in the same jeans, the same blazer, the same flats, because the point had never been the outfit. The foyer still smelled of lemon oil and lamp polish, but the air felt different, as if someone had opened a window. The manager met my eyes at the door and gave me a small, genuine smile that didn't have to hide a script. He led me to the table, and I sat where I had before, folding my hands on the linen like a quiet flag. They were waiting. My parents' faces showed the soft, awkward carefulness of people who've been instructed in a new etiquette, how to meet someone they'd misread for years. Vivian's hair was still immaculate, but her smile this time was unforced. My father, who used to measure the room with a ruler of approval and shame, looked at me with something close to pride that didn't try to reclaim the conversation. He stood when I arrived and offered the chair at the head of the table without ceremony, a small public gesture that felt larger than any speech. "Good to have you here," he said, and the sentence didn't need anything else. Conversations moved differently, less performative, more curious. They asked about the renovation not as a way to belittle, but to understand. How did you decide on that layout? Who did you hire for the kitchen? What does it take to run evenings when the club transforms for a wedding? Staff joined in, and members leaned forward with actual interest rather than the furtive, gossip-shaped attention I'd felt before. When Vivian asked me what I liked most about owning the place, I told her. The mornings before service, the team bantering in the prep kitchen, the way a nervous couple's faces relax when the room finally looks like their idea of home. She listened like someone taking notes, and later, over coffee, she told me she'd read the articles I'd sent her and was proud in a way that felt unperformative. My mother's apology had arrived in moments of smallness. A text with a photo of the magazine, a hand that reached for mine when a server refilled her wine. My father's change came in quieter forms, fewer jokes about my choices, more questions about how he could help without stepping on my decisions. He introduced me to a table of members as Clara Hale, owner of Ashford Vale. He didn't cough the words out with the old qualifying tone. He said them like they were true and left it there. We didn't fix history in a single brunch. Old comments will have a way of surfacing later, and I know well that people are prone to slipping back into old vocabularies when they're tired or scared. But that day, the ledger in my head shifted from a running tally of slights to a different accounting. Small acts of respect, paid weekly. I felt my shoulders unclench in a way that was almost physical. When I left the clubhouse that afternoon, the sun was soft on the drive home, and there was a quiet in my chest I hadn't recognized as relief until it stepped forward. Not triumphant, not theatrical, simply true. Justice, in my book, didn't arrive as a spectacle. It arrived as a series of small, steady corrections, apologies that were kept, questions that were asked instead of assumed, hands that reached to help rather than to hide. I had wanted them to see me. They had seen me. That is not the same as being forgiven overnight, but it's the only place real repair can begin. I walked back to my car with my blazer slung over my shoulder and my flats squeaking softly on the pavement, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I'd reclaimed not just a space in their house, but the story I get to tell about myself.